Hi. I've been looking at some old pictures I found up here in the attic. Most of the people in them, I suppose, are related to me, though I must confess there are a great many of them I don't recognize. They lived long before my time. I also found some pictures of people that I know were not related to me. I bet this fellow's picture can be found in a great many houses, and maybe that's as it should be, because he's often called the father of our country. That makes him kind of related to all of us, doesn't it? What's his name? George Washington, that's right. And no story about America would be complete if we didn't learn something more about him. Today, let's find out something about his life before he became the father of our country. When George Washington was born, there was no United States of America. There were only 13 colonies, and they all belonged to England. George Washington was born in the colony of Virginia on February 22nd, 1732. He was born on a farm. In those days, there were no big cities, and most people lived on farms. But as Washington grew up, more and more people came to the colonies. Soon, all the good farmland was gone. So people began to move onto the land west of the English colonies. And then there was trouble. 3 different groups of people said the western lands belonged to them: the English, the French, and the Indians. The English king said,
"All the land west of our colonies belongs to England, too."
But the French king said the land belonged to France. And the Indians said that it was their land, that their God had given the land to them. Well, nobody paid any attention to the Indians. The King of France sent soldiers to build forts in the land west of Virginia. And when the King of England heard about this, he wrote a letter to the governor of Virginia. That letter was the beginning of George Washington's adventures. The king wrote,
"Tell the French to get off my land."
The governor couldn't take this letter to the French soldiers. He was too busy. But he had heard of a young man who knew all about the western lands because he had spent 3 months there measuring the land for farms. That man was George Washington. The governor of Virginia gave 21-year-old George the king's letter to deliver. Washington got on his horse and rode west for several days. Then he came to the beginning of the wilderness, land that now is part of the states of Pennsylvania and Ohio. In Washington state, this land seemed very far west indeed. On and on he rode. Then he came to land that was strange to him. He needed a guide. Washington hired a woodsman named Christopher Gist to guide him to the French. After many days, the 2 men came to the French fort. Washington gave his letter to the French commander. The commander read it carefully. Then he shook his head and explained he had orders to stay. The French would not leave the western lands. Their horses were too tired to carry Washington and Christopher back to Virginia. They would have to be left at the French fort, and the men would have to walk until they could find fresh horses. It was December, and it was very cold. Oh, at home in Virginia, Washington rode a horse everywhere he wanted to go. He was not used to walking in winter woods. That night, the two men slept on the bare ground. When Washington woke in the morning, oh, his feet were swollen. How they hurt. But he got up and followed Christopher through the woods once more, slowly. Snow began to fall as they went deeper into the woods. Christopher looked all around him. All at once, he didn't know which way to go. Just then, an Indian stepped out from behind a tree. He told the men to follow him. He said he would show them the way through the woods. Christopher frowned. He didn't trust the Indian. He knew that many Indians hated the white men who were taking their land. And this Indian was carrying a gun. But Washington said,
"We have to trust him, Chris. We're lost."
The two men followed the Indian. After a time, Christopher stopped. The Indian seemed to be leading them away from Virginia, not toward it. Christopher asked the Indian,
"Where's this cabin of yours? How far away is it?"
It is as far away as this, as far as a gun can be heard.
The two men followed behind the Indian for a long time. Then Christopher spoke again.
"How far is your cabin now?"
2 war whoops away.
Something's wrong. He's not leading us in the right direction at all. It's a trap. Stop!
The Indian stopped. He spun around and fired his gun at the men. Christopher fell to the ground. Washington ran over to his friend.
Chris, are you hurt?
Christopher wasn't hurt. He sat up quickly and aimed his gun at the Indian. But before he could fire it, Washington knocked it out of his hand and said they must let the Indian go. The Indian was gone. But he might come back. Oh, it would be easy for him to creep up behind them in the woods. The sun went down, but Washington and Christopher walked all night, and they walked all the next day, too. They wanted to get out of those dark woods. Finally, they came to the last trees. They were safe. About 4 months later, more than 100 men left the colony of Virginia. Their horses were old. Their guns were older still. They didn't have any uniforms at all. But they were soldiers, off to fight the French. And out in front rode George Washington. He was only 22 years old. He didn't know a thing about war. But the governor of Virginia thought George was a natural leader, someone other men would listen to. Washington's soldiers had to cut a road into the wilderness. Step by step, axe blow by axe blow, they cut through the woods. Oh, it was hard work. At last, Washington called a halt. They had come to a good resting place. There was grass for the horses, water for the men. Washington told his soldiers to make log buildings and fences. This was the first English fort in the western lands, and they called it Fort Necessity. There, Washington and his men waited. They knew the French were somewhere in those woods, but where? Then one day, an Indian slipped into the fort. He spoke to Washington.
"I am Silverheels, one of Half King's braves. He has sent for you."
Washington nodded. He knew Half King. Half King was a friend. Silverheels pointed into the forest.
"We have seen footprints in the woods, footprints of French shoes. I will take you to Half King. He will show you these footprints and lead you to the French."
Washington and his soldiers followed Silverheels to the camp of Half King. Half King made a sign that meant, "Follow me." He took them through the woods. He stopped. He pointed. And there, Washington saw the French soldiers hidden under a big cliff. The French saw George Washington, too. Suddenly, the first bullet of the war was fired. Washington's men were ready for a fight. They had come looking for one. But the French soldiers were surprised. Most of them had been sleeping, and it took time for them to jump up and grab their guns. Too much time. The fight was soon over, and Washington had won. The war against the French and the Indians went on and on. Washington and his men never had enough guns or bullets or food or blankets, but they stayed and fought for 3 more years. Finally, the last of the French soldiers left the western woods. The English had won the war. George Washington went home to his plantation, Mount Vernon. 16 happy, peaceful years passed. Washington was growing older, and he was sure his adventures were behind him now. Oh, he didn't miss them at all. Maybe George Washington didn't miss adventure, but adventures were happening all around him. The quiet years for the colonies were over. The American colonies had belonged to England for many years. Now, a lot of Americans wanted to be free from English rule, even if it meant going to war. But if war came, who would lead the soldiers? Oh, that was a big question, and one that needed to be answered quickly. Many important men of the colonies met together in the town of Philadelphia to talk about their troubles with England. There were merchants from New York, lawyers from New England, there were men who simply had a lot of money, and there was a tall planter from Virginia, George Washington. Washington was a few days late getting to the meeting, and when he walked through the door, everyone looked up. He was so sure war would start that he'd come dressed in his old army uniform. Who would make the best general for the new American army? Almost everyone got up and made a speech for the man he wanted. George Washington did not make a speech. He might whisper a word to a friend, but no speech. He was too shy for that. Most of the men at the meeting had heard of George Washington, and when the question was asked, "Who is the greatest man here?" the answer came back.
If you mean who can make the best speeches, I'd say Rutledge of South Carolina. But if you want a man of sound judgment, George Washington of Virginia is the greatest man here.
Many must have agreed with this, for on June 15th, 1775, the men picked their general, George Washington. Washington wanted this job, yet at the same time he didn't. He remembered too much. He remembered watching men go hungry in the war against the French and the Indians. He remembered watching men die. But he believed in this fight. He wanted America to be free. And he had to admit to himself that he really did like to be in the middle of things. Just one more adventure, Washington thought to himself. In the summer of 1775, General George Washington rode away from Mount Vernon to the biggest adventure of all, the Revolutionary War. And it was a long adventure. The war lasted 6 years before the American colonists won their freedom from England. Then a new country was born, the United States of America. I bet I don't have to tell you who was chosen to be the very first president of our new country. Who was it? That's right, none other than the man we've been hearing about today, George Washington. The stories I told you came from this book, The Adventures of George Washington, by Mickey Davidson. I wonder who we'll hear about the next time we meet. I guess we'll have to wait to find out. And I'll see you then. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.